People often make an unfair correlation between pulp and being low effort. The truth is that it was not low effort, but low cost. The term comes from wood pulp. Pulp magazines of the early 20th century were printed on cheap, low-grade paper made from wood pulp to keep costs down, and authors published within were often paid far less than their counterparts in other parts of the industry. Nevertheless, many well-regarded authors would get their starts in pulp magazines. Lovecraft, Asimov, Philip K. Dick and Arthur C. Clarke, even Frank Herbert. Pulp would often focus on what were considered lowbrow and exciting genres such as hard-boiled detectives, gangsters, westerns, science fiction and horror. They went out of fashion in the wake of World War II, both due to changing tastes and difficulty in supplying even the low-grade paper of the time, but their spirit lived on in the form of low-grade, low-cost paperback novels. The attitude of pulp often lives on throughout much of entertainment media as well, including games. Like pulp magazines and novels, games tend to focus more on excitement and action to quickly draw the audience in, but finding games that are unabashedly and wholeheartedly inspired by pulp tropes and styles isn't as common as you might think. Developer Terminal Reality would release 3 very pulp-horror inspired action games that we're going to be having a look at today, namely Nocturne and Bloodrayne 1 and 2. I should note we won't be looking at Bloodrayne Betrayal, the 2D action platformer, for 2 reasons. 1, I don't own it, and the budget for this channel is a piece of paper with the word no written on it. Secondly, because if I talk about Nocturne and the 2 3D Bloodrayne games, then this is a video about Terminal Reality's action games. If I include Betrayal, then it becomes worryingly close to a Bloodrayne retrospective, and then I might have to mention the god-awful Uwe Boll films. And no one wants that. So, to keep everyone sane, we'll be starting with Nocturne. My sister's been renovating her house recently, so her cat's been staying with us instead. She's a weird cat, pretty scruffy all things considered. Likes watching magpies. Some of her behaviour is pretty normal, some of it's regular cat weird, and some of it's weird even for a cat. I find I like the cat a great deal, and every so often she throws up all over the carpet. This is kind of how I feel about Nocturne. Released in 1999, Nocturne is kind of a mess, ahead of its time in some ways, already antiquated in others. Not that interesting on the surface, and yet I couldn't stop playing it, even after being certain I was going to. I really ended up liking it, but wow does it like throwing up all over the carpet, metaphorically speaking, of course. The game is split into 4 episodes, each narratively disconnected from one another, but united in an overall sense of pulp horror. You're a member of the Domestic Supernatural Defense and Research League, colloquially known as Spook House, a secret government organisation of the USA responsible for defending against supernatural entities, as well as collecting and protecting supernatural objects. Specifically, you take on the role of a man simply referred to as the Stranger. Stranger has around 3 personality traits. He hates monsters, he's great at killing monsters, and he is very grumpy. He gives off strong noir vibes, but the game as a whole will touch on a variety of pulpy settings throughout, including gangsters and the Old West. Episodes take place between 1927 and 1935, with the first being the most important for our purposes. Episode 1, Dark Reign of the Vampire King, sees the Stranger teaming up with Svetlana, a half-vampire Damphir armed with a pair of curved blades. The two are sent off to Germany to find the Yathgi Stone, the Vampire Holy Grail, an artifact that will allow any vampire that wields it to become immune to their natural weaknesses. Spook House wants it under lock and key so it can't be used for nefarious deeds. Starting out in Nocturne can take some getting used to. It uses a fixed camera angle for the entire game, which will feel familiar to fans of other survival horror games of the time. Unfortunately, it will quickly become apparent that while Nocturne is visually in tune with the survival horror genre, it plays more like a straight action game. With the exception of a few sequences, ammo and health are reasonably generous, and you are expected to face down every enemy you encounter, but you'll spend as much time fighting the controls as you do the enemies. Tank controls are fine for slower, more deliberate games, but Nocturne plays just a little faster than its contemporaries, leaving you 2 choices. If you play entirely using the keyboard, you won't be able to turn quickly enough to fight certain enemies or respond to ambushes. If you use your mouse for aiming, then you have to use your mouse to aim with a character whose orientation is constantly changing. Moving and fighting never feels good in either mode, but the mouse and keyboard is the way to go. In either mode, you'll have to make generous use of the auto-lock features. Woe betide the person who turns that off. Aiming solely based on the location of the laser sight on your gun is functionally impossible, which also slightly obfuscates an interesting mechanic. I'm pretty sure the game features limb-based damage, and the ability to remove certain body parts from some enemies to change their behaviour slightly, but the necessity of the auto-lock means that 99% of the time you're aiming at the centre of mass anyway, so it doesn't factor in much. Even with the auto-lock aiming though, the fixed camera angles will constantly have you fighting enemies off-screen. I did eventually get used to the controls, which were the first major hurdle to get over enjoying the game, but it doesn't make it easy to do so. The second level of the episode drops you into a werewolf-infested forest. Large numbers of werewolves constantly ambush you, leaving you little time to respond, often surrounding and stun-locking you within seconds. This section almost had me quitting the game, only knowing where the ambushes will happen so I could trigger them and back away immediately allowed me to make it through to the end. While this isn't the most difficult sequence in the game, it is particularly aggravating given it comes so early in the experience. Either way, this is definitely a game to be hammering quick save at every opportunity, as the lack of autosaves will come back to bite you otherwise. The biggest area of the episode demonstrates the other major problem with the fixed camera angles. Navigating becomes a slog. While in something like Resident Evil, the levels are sectioned off into rooms with loading screens between them, making it easy to compartmentalise the spaces and map out the entire area in your head, Nocturne's levels feature no loading screens within them, but the fixed camera angles, often multiple per room, constantly switch your orientation, making getting your bearings and mapping out the space difficult. In Castle Gaustadt, you need to do this while gradually rotating through the entire map multiple times, collecting the various key items needed to move on. Working out how all the areas connect to one another is hard enough, but finding a key and trying to remember where the corresponding door is nearly impossible. The result is you have to just keep doing multiple laps of the entire area, making sure to completely circumnavigate each room to ensure you didn't miss an exit. Descending into the depths of Castle Gaustadt, you find that Svetlana has been overcome by the power of the vampire count within, so you're on your own to defeat him. Not that he's too hard to defeat, the actual boss fight is far easier than the fixed camera jumping puzzle earlier in the level. Svetlana is released from his grip as soon as he dies, just in time for the episode's big twist. The Count in Castle Gaustadt was actually the son of the mayor of the nearby town. The mayor's son stole the Yathki stone from him, but kept him nearby to try and learn its secrets. Now his son is dead, the mayor takes over Castle Gaustadt again, and regains the Yathki stone. Which is fine, apparently. Svetlana insists you leave while you can, and that leaving the Yathki stone here will have no negative repercussions. Which, to be fair, it doesn't, but it still seems like an odd story beat to reveal right at the end and then just move on from. The episodes do trend downwards in quality as they go on, though they never truly become terrible. The second, Tomb of the Underground God, starts out on a werewolf-infested train, which is a great setup. Aside from the pack alpha you have to fight at the end, I'm sure beating him legitimately is possible, but the only way I found to do it was running backwards down the ladder from the carriage roof so he jumps off the train and dies. The train takes you to an Old West town infested with zombies, complete with zombie cows, that you need to investigate with the help of your colleague, who is protected by Baron Samedi, Voodoo Loire of the Dead. Voodoo has a long, deep and complex history, which, in true pulp fashion, Nocturne has no interest in engaging with. The exoticization of foreign cultures and traditions is one of those sticky subjects, and it's easy to criticize many works for not properly engaging with or even accurately representing the cultures and histories they draw from. Voodoo alone has a long history of being misrepresented and demonized within Western media, from White Zombie to Live and Let Die. It's still possible to enjoy such works on their own merits, of course, so long as you recognise they aren't a good source upon which to base an understanding of such things, though it is certainly a shame so many people do base their understanding of such things on these kinds of exoticised misrepresentations. I realised that the inclusion of a real religious figure such as Baron Samedi being reduced to the same supernatural weight of vampires and werewolves would be disappointing to people hoping for a more authentic representation of such an element, disrespectful even, but I also think that such disrespect is not the intention, and sometimes it's worth trying to meet a work where its intentions lie. Nocturne certainly wants to be pulpy horror action, which it is, and to its credit it never demonises voodoo in the way so many other works do. The inclusion of Baron Samedi may not be very detailed, but it adds a little depth and flavour to an otherwise pretty basic setup, and it fits in well with the tone and various other unexpected inclusions throughout the rest of the game. The Old West zombie town is a fun setting, but it's hampered by having to perform several escort quests back and forth across town to save the local people. Eventually, the Trail of the Dead leads you to the local mines, another confusing zone, but at least one that shows off some of Nocturne's most unique graphical features. There is a surprisingly effective dynamic lighting system in place throughout, not only allowing you to use a flashlight to light up the darker tunnels, but is also used to great effect when shadows from environmental lights can alert you to enemies out of view. The Stranger also has access to a pair of night vision goggles. These switch the player into first person for a grainy and hard to make out view of the environment. It's actually not that useful for dark areas, but it is helpful throughout the game to get a quick peek in first person to orient yourself and make sure you didn't miss a corridor hidden by camera angles. Working your way deeper into the mines reveals the source of the zombie outbreak, a temple full of strange grub-like monsters. The temple itself is unlike anything else in the game, and it's one of my favourite zones, especially the sleeping elder god hanging menacingly at its centre. Like much of the game, it feels like the story and environments would be at home in a Call of Cthulhu tabletop campaign, fitting nicely into the pulp horror theme, but the gameplay makes it feel like the players completely misunderstood the vibe as pulp adventure, and bought combat-focused characters instead of investigators. Strangely, my favourite thing about the area was actually seeing what kinds of dumb encounters the game would make you do with a fixed camera angle. Jumping puzzles, timed gauntlets, avoiding traps, none of it felt good, but by this point I was fascinated to see what else the game would throw up. The game would test my conviction going forwards, however. Windy City Massacre was something of a turning point for me, when the game started to be more of a chore. It takes place in Chicago, where real-life mob boss Al Capone is using a German scientist to resurrect his men. The Stranger needs to team up with turncoat undead mobster Icepick to find the factory and stop the army of, I kid you not, Frankenstein's mobsters. All of this is absolute nonsense, and it is absolutely what I'm here for. It's a shame then that the sequence mostly takes place through several revisits of the same map, running back and forth through the maze-like streets while an endless stream of undead gangsters attack you with Tommy guns, desperately hoping you don't forget where you're supposed to go next, and that's if it even is clear where you're supposed to go next. It's not without its charms. There's plenty of nooks and crannies to poke your nose into, and mowing down undead mobsters with a Tommy gun is a lot of fun, but the sequence really starts to drag by the end of it, and not even the addition of a flamethrower towards the end can lift the sequence. Finally, the house on the edge of hell really lives up to its name. It's a pity since the final episode is the most narratively interesting. An ex-Spookhouse operative, the best monster killer there ever was, has contracted his old colleagues to ask for help with something at his estate out in France. Of course, everything is not as it seems. Killian makes for a compelling villain at first. He's set up as the shadow of what the Stranger might become. Stranger hates monsters, but it's nothing compared to Killian. His wife was slowly turned into a vampire in revenge for his work, and he had to kill her himself, which drove him mad. He became Spookhouse's most deadly agent, but finally quit the organisation in disgust when they started accepting monsters into the organisation. The whole episode is the most puzzle-heavy in the game, but not in a fun way. The graveyard is bad enough where you can be soft-locked if you accidentally kill one of the imps holding a key at a funny angle, dropping it through the world, but the mansion itself is an absolute nightmare. It is a convoluted maze of dead ends, insta-kill traps and locked doors, all the while filled with dangerous monsters and the stingiest distribution of health and ammo. It makes up all of the worst aspects of this kind of design, from unclear objectives to pixel hunts for keys. It's also where the game finally beat me. Nocturne, on my system, was particularly crash-happy. I upload most of the footage I record for these videos to an archive channel, but I don't think I'll be able to for this game. Despite the game being on the shorter end of things, my recording is split into 33 parts, some as short as a minute, because the game would intermittently crash on load, on camera change, even during certain cutscenes. But here in the final episode, my save game gave up the ghost, and became corrupted, making it impossible to load. I wasn't willing to drag myself through the whole of the last episode again, just to get footage of the game's final 20 minutes. I didn't miss a huge amount, one final obnoxious puzzle followed by Killian's death. After that, all that's left was the epilogue to set up bait for a sequel that would never come. I know I've been pretty critical of Nocturne. It is genuinely kind of a mess, but I did have a good time with it. The atmosphere is great and the variety of pulpy setups are a lot of fun, even if playing through them can be frustrating at times. The lighting was ahead of its time, and the attempt to join the fixed camera angles and style of survival horror with the more action-focused pacing of shooters was an admirable, if misguided one. Nocturne is something of a dead end of game mechanics that didn't really go anywhere. It's interesting to see mechanics and systems that have kind of died out in the modern industry being experimented with back in the day, even if the result goes to show why they fell out of fashion in the first place. It never got a direct sequel, which is a shame, but it would influence two of Terminal Reality's future projects. First was an absolutely baffling trilogy of games based on the Blair Witch franchise. All three games would be made by different developers and released within about a month of one another, but all three would use Nocturne's engine and gameplay loop as its basis. The first of the three would be developed directly by Terminal Reality, and would feature Doc Holliday, a supporting member of Spook House, being sent to Burkittsville to investigate, after the stranger turns down the job. The other two games weren't as focused on Spook House or characters from Nocturne, but it's still a bizarre set of licensed games that may warrant my own investigation in a future video. The other game Nocturne influenced was, of course, Bloodrayne. Bloodrayne began development as Nocturne 2, but when the development team started working with a new publisher, they weren't willing to share the Nocturne license with a new partner, so decided to begin a new franchise instead. The result is a more refined, more action-focused game. Easy to get into for newcomers, but one that still feels familiar in a lot of ways to Nocturne. Take the player's character, for example. Rain is a half-vampire Damphir, armed with a pair of curved blades. It's Svetlana again. In fact, beta footage seems to suggest that Rain began life as Svetlana, and then changes were made sometime after they switched to a new license. Beside a visual redesign, though, not a great deal of work seems to have gone into making her a real character. Rain is a little empty at times, and mostly generic at others. Snappy one-liners and disinterest are about as good as it gets. She's a very standard action lead. This isn't necessarily a problem. Complex narrative work certainly isn't the focus of the game, so a bare-bones character to revolve the action around is serviceable. Her basic motivation is to hunt down and murder her father, a vampire named Kagan, who killed her entire family after she was born. None of this backstory is actually relevant to the first game, but in her quest for vengeance, she joins up with the Brimstone Society. Brimstone are far less dynamic or interesting than Spook House. Ostensibly a secret order of vampire hunters, their organisation isn't expanded on beyond Rain working for them. They don't even seem to live up to their reputation as vampire hunters, given that the primary villain of the first game isn't a vampire. In fact, one of the only other vampires in the game is Mintz, another member of Brimstone. While you do face vampires later in the game, they're never really the primary focus of the plot, and tend to blend in with the other monsters you fight, like zombies, demon parasites, spider monsters, and of course, Nazis. You don't start out fighting Nazis, though. The game starts out with Rain's first mission for Brimstone. Sent into the swamps of Louisiana in 1933 alongside Mintz to investigate reports of a strange sickness that started to affect the townsfolk and discover the cause. The sickness is zombies, and the cause is spider monsters, though it's never clear how the two connect. This portion of the game is basically a lower intensity introduction and basic tease for the plot, all wrapped in a similar setup to Nocturne's second episode. You fight your way through the village and swamps, destroying the spiders' nests and eventually fighting the biggest spider monster that appears to have killed Mince. Upon defeating it, Rain pulls a strange bone from its corpse and immediately stabs herself in the chest with it, which doesn't appear to have been the best idea. A strange German man who townsfolk mentioned was also sniffing around steals it while Rain is unconscious. What this was and who he is won't be revealed until much later in the game, but it's no great mystery. The rest of the plot takes place 5 years later when Rain is sent on the trail of the man to stop his occult machinations, which means you're going to kill a hell of a lot of Nazis. Fortunately, Bloodrayne makes the wholesale slaughter of Nazis fairly satisfying. Combat in Bloodrayne tends towards being wildly chaotic. Nocturne's fixed camera angles and tank controls have been replaced with a more straightforward third-person control scheme, though Rain retains the Stranger's generous weapons lock and ability to aim at 2 foes at once. You don't get a great deal of precise control over your guns, you don't even have direct control over which ones are equipped at any given time, instead deciding either to use the weakest or strongest guns you happen to be holding. You don't reload, so you fire until it's empty, then toss it aside, with the game managing picking up weapons as you go. As a result, you're encouraged to use firearms liberally, since they won't last long, and it won't be long before you grab some more of your enemy's corpses anyway. Of course, the need to close the gap to pick these guns up results in the game having a much more melee-oriented focus overall. The general approach is to fire wildly while you charge in, before cutting down anyone who's left, taking their guns, and repeating the process on the next group of enemies. As the game goes on, your melee combos develop and lengthen, both the regular version and your powered up Blood Rage combo, and you also get an infinite use time slowdown, but combat is never particularly nuanced. No complex combos or deep movesets, simply shooting guns and swinging swords. Of course, amidst all this you're likely to take a fair number of hits, and this is where vampirism helps. Any humanoid enemy is a walking health pack, you just have to puncture their necks and drink them like a Capri Sun first. You'll usually want to do this with the last few enemies from a group, given that you are still vulnerable while drinking, though you can still shoot and rotate your enemies to shield you from gunfire. Either way, you're going to be drinking a lot of Nazis throughout the game, and based on the voice acting, it sounds like Rain really enjoys the taste of blood. I mean, really enjoys it. There's no two ways about it. The sexualization of Rain is a central aspect of Bloodrayne's identity. From the poses and noises she makes while drinking blood, to her personality and skin-tight leather outfit that certainly wouldn't fit in circa the 1930s, every aspect of Rain's design has been built around sexually appealing to a male demographic. The same can be said about the limited number of other female characters throughout the game. I have in the past, and surely will again in the future, criticised the sexualisation of female characters in games, but I'm not going to here. My criticism of the sexual objectification of women comes from its ubiquity, and its unnecessary inclusion in games that otherwise would have no place for it. But with the sexualisation of Rain, as such a central characteristic of the game, I don't really have a problem with it. I completely understand why someone might. The argument that the sexualisation of women in all forms is unacceptable is a perfectly reasonable position to hold, even if it's not one I hold myself. While in other games the sexualisation of women as a peripheral inclusion might put someone off a game they would have otherwise enjoyed, it being a central part of the game's appeal leads to a much stronger case for those people who simply not play it. I completely get why someone wouldn't want to play games with such overt objectification, but it's clear that it was going to be the case before you even start the game, so if you aren't into that, it's easier to avoid. It's not something you're going to be blindsided with that brings down an otherwise enjoyable experience. The developers clearly wanted to make a game where a sexy vampire lady murders Nazis, and more power to them for going ahead and making it, though equally, no disrespect to those who aren't interested in playing such games. Pulp media has a long history of connection with exploitation media too. While not ubiquitous, certainly many pulp tales equally use violence and sexuality as a cheap and easy way to drive engagement. It's not particularly clever, there are certainly more interesting ways of engaging an audience, but sometimes you aren't in the mood for something deep and complex, sometimes you don't have much energy and just want something that can keep your attention and waste some time, and Bloodrayne fits well into this lineage of media. Vampires too have a history of connection with sexuality. Both the seduction of victims and the sharing of bodily fluids are, and have historically been, clear associations with sexuality, which further justifies its inclusion within the series, even if those aspects aren't universal features of vampirism. Vampires throughout narratives, both popular and folk, have a wide variety of features and characteristics, with the drinking of blood being just about the only universal constant. Even some aspects taken as a given aren't as universal as you might think. Vulnerability to sunlight, for example, is often seen as an important aspect of the vampirism, but even the original Dracula by Bram Stoker, arguably the most widely recognised and influential work of vampire fiction, features a vampire that isn't harmed by sunlight. Dracula is perfectly able to exist in full sunlight. He is weakened, no stronger than a regular human, and lacking access to his more supernatural powers, but he isn't harmed by it, despite that being such a widely accepted aspect of vampire mythology. Bloodrayne, and even more so its sequel, uses this variability to great effect, allowing a wide variety of vampires across both games, with interesting and differing abilities. Nocturne also has this variety of vampires, though like Nocturne, Bloodrayne is just as interested in fighting other varieties of monsters, such as the zombies and spider monsters of Louisiana, or the Demites of Argentina. The Argentina sections of the game is in many ways the weakest, which is a shame. It's when the Nazis get introduced as the primary enemy you'll be facing from then on. Pulp media actually predates the Nazis, but the level of villainy the regime would embody has since made them a staple of media itself inspired by earlier pulp works. The Nazis' interest with the occult also makes them a good fit in this regard, and the combination is used in works varying from Wolfenstein games to the History Channel. The Nazis are also a much more dynamic enemy than the zombies of Louisiana, and the upgrade in weaponry is well received, advancing the combat to the frenetic pace that it will maintain throughout the rest of the game. The problem is the environment. A huge portion of the Argentina section could have been set anywhere in the world, since it revolves entirely around concrete bunkers and the mines beneath them. There's actually more environmental variety here than the swamps and wood buildings of Louisiana, but it's a style of environment that is far more common in video games overall, and the repetition of areas as you travel back and forth between them gives the midsection of the game something of a monotonous pace. There's a long list of mostly nondescript officers you've been sent to kill, occasionally broken up by higher ranking members of the occult research team you're chasing. They're a more varied bunch and lead to a series of boss fights that range from easy to frustrating. Sometimes at the same time, like the High Priest in his mobile machine gun equipped pulpit, or the Commander who doesn't speak and constantly flashbangs you and disappears. Of course, after a few levels of painting the walls with Nazi blood, the occult research they were performing breaks out of the lower areas of the base and becomes a much bigger problem. The Demites are parasitic floating heads that kill and take over the bodies of the base's guards in a way that is far more gruesome than the limited graphical capabilities of the time could adequately depict. Sinister as they are, they don't act much different from regular humans, aside from the inflated health pools, and the research labs they've broken out of aren't much less generic than the bunkers that precede them, though the addition of infighting between the two groups does ratchet up the chaotic nature of the combat nicely, further escalating the conflict. Despite the slightly flat presentation of the rest of Argentina, it does at least end on something of a high note. Not a very high note, mind you. The interior of the Demites' nest has some of the more finicky platforming sequences in the game, but the temple is built like a termite mound made of flesh. Like the Demites themselves, the game does lack the visual fidelity to properly convey the brutality of the space, but the area is evocative enough to convey the intended feeling, and the twisted warrens combined with the constant fighting between the Nazis and the Demites is disorienting in a way that is narratively suitable, without being mechanically frustrating. Rain beats the Nazis to the artifact at the centre of the temple, the right eye of Beliar, which once again, like the artifact in Louisiana, Rain immediately jams into her own eye socket, though instead of passing out this time, it gives her the ability to zoom her vision. Finally escaping the temple, you follow the Nazis as they abandon the base to hunt down the final artifact thereafter, the Heart of Beliar. Beliar is an ancient demon, possibly the original devil. The head of the Nazis' occult division, a man named Wolf, has been hunting the different body parts of the demon in the hopes of resurrecting him and enhancing his own troops. He's collected several parts of Beliar, integrating the body parts into himself like Rain has with the eye, but the heart is the final piece needed to resurrect Beliar completely. It turns out the heart was in Germany all along. In fact, we've already encountered it in this video. It was previously known as the Yathki Stone, and it is still kept in Castle Gaustadt. The return to Castle Gaustadt makes for the best sequence in the game. Most of this is due to the aesthetic nature of the scene. While Louisiana was an original but kind of samey swamp, and Argentina featured generic bunkers with a few more interesting areas, Germany features a series of castle ruins, snowy mountain passes, and a vast Gothic cathedral beyond it all. It's an especially fun sequence for people who previously played Nocturne, as the second level features a pretty complete recreation of the layout of Nocturne's rendition of the space. There are some aesthetic differences, a few bits moved around, but for the most part it's a ruined version of the same castle you explored from the fixed camera angles of the previous game. Germany also improves on the previous areas due to the ramp up in difficulty. The Nazis are present in greater numbers, with more advanced units and improved weaponry. Similar to the three-way fight between you, the Nazis, and the D-Mites of Argentina, there's a host of vampires also assaulting the castle to keep the three-way combat going. The vampire host is led by Hedrox the Infinite, a strange monster able to regenerate copies of himself from severed limbs. His horde assaults the previous owner of the castle, the mayor you helped in Nocturne, in an attempt to take the Yathki Stone, now the Heart of Beliar, for himself. Hedrox's vampires are more monstrous than Rain or Mince, and include a number of varieties that were included in Nocturne, another nice nod to the older work, but more importantly, the differing nature of the monsters differentiates combat with them better than the D-Mites did earlier. Overall, the improved Nazi forces, more dynamic vampires, and generally more complex environments all combine to increase the difficulty enough that you actually have to start thinking about encounters. You can't just fire and shoot and expect to make it through like you could earlier, and just that little extra level of engagement really improves the sequence, making it the high point of the game, with some exceptions. There's a few specific set pieces that let the final act down. Piloting a Nazi mech through a cathedral sounds fun, but in practice it controls just slightly too awkwardly, and the enemies are just slightly too tanky for it to work. The boss fight with Hedrox maintains the balance of being overly frustrating to work out what you need to do, but too easy once you do manage to. There's also a run across a bridge that requires too much trial and error. They're all weaker sequences, but none of them really bring the section down too much. The same can't be said for the final boss, unfortunately. The game ends with a three-way boss fight between Rain, the supernaturally enhanced wolf, and Beliar, reborn from his heart. Beliar and Wolf will fight one another as well as Rain, keeping the mechanical nature of the rest of the game, but neither is engaging to fight individually. Wolf is immune to firearms, but pretty easy to take down in melee if you're using your rage meter. Beliar, on the other hand, can only be damaged by guns, but is only vulnerable if you shoot him in the heart, which leaves you at the mercy of the game's auto-aim. There's weapons scattered around the environment, but it's only enough to bring down Beliar's health if you're lucky and don't waste any ammo on Wolf. In theory you can defeat them in either order. In practice you really have to keep Wolf aggroed on Beliar to help you kill him, and then take Wolf out afterwards. It's a frustratingly dull ending to an otherwise good time. Having defeated Beliar and slaughtered Wolf along with his occult division, Brimstone finally contacts you to set up the sequel. They finally have a lead on Kagan, Rain's father, who she's been hunting since the intro cinematic. The sequel will focus on hunting him down. Well, kind of. 2004's Bloodrayne 2 takes place around 70 years later during what was then the present day. Kagan was killed in a flashback just a year after the events of the first game, so the hopes of hunting him down and getting Rain her revenge are dashed quickly, at least until he comes back. Why Terminal Reality chose to sequel bait Kagan, then kill him off between games, only to surprise reveal he wasn't dead after all, is a mystery to me, but it is the narrative direction they chose. Initially, Rain is hunting the rest of his children, who have formed the cult of Kagan, to stop their plans, which were Kagan's plans, which it turns out are still Kagan's plans, because of the needless fake-out flashback that Kagan survived due to a throwaway line of dialogue. The plot is kind of a mess overall. Events seem to happen without a great deal of reason. Characters betray one another because it's time for a story beat, rather than having any compelling reason to do so, and there's several interesting plot points brought up and then dropped with little fanfare. Take Severin, for example. He's a supporting character providing Rain with intel over the radio. He used to be thrall to one of the vampires you face until Rain rescued him. This is mentioned a couple of times, but never really factors in at all. Or take Kagan's resurrection. He dies in an explosion while holding a strange mass of crystals stolen from Brimstone. When the cult brought him back to life, he had them embedded into his skin. There's some vague allusions to them controlling the power of the sun, and he seems to draw power from them while also being hurt by them, but it never amounts to anything. No clear indication what they do, what they are, or why Brimstone had them in the first place. Just a general implication that they're powerful, and a throwaway line that they were used in some manner to create the sun guns the vampires start using on one another later in the game. Not even the sun guns themselves are particularly original, since Spookhouse issues the Stranger with a portable one all the way back in episode 1 of Nocturne. None of the characters have any real personality beyond their most basic functions in the plot. The hot-headed one, the scheming, sneaky one, the science-crazed one. They're all pretty bland and predictable, all the way up to Kagan himself. Of course, you might be shouting at the screen, who cares about the narrative? Which is fair, though the obvious answer is I do, otherwise I wouldn't be talking about it. Gameplay, unfortunately, doesn't fare a great deal better. In brief, it's a far more complex system, but less well executed and more generic to boot. Melee is emphasised with the addition of basic combo systems and special moves, kicks and blade attacks have been separated out, and weapons now take their own dedicated slots. The guns, the Carpathian Dragons, are acquired early and gain upgrades and different firing modes throughout the game. You can't pick up enemy weapons anymore, so the rhythm of combat feels completely different. Even more so due to the blood drinking. While drinking blood still heals you, the interaction has been expanded. The Carpathian Dragons also run on blood, and using them while they're empty will damage Rain instead, so when drinking enemies you can instead choose to refill your weapons, or you can cut the drinking animation short with an execution, which massively boosts your rage meter, a special bar for using abilities. This expanded importance of drinking enemies and the reduced aggressiveness of enemies during these interactions can give the combat a real stop-start feeling to it, constantly relying on drinking enemies rather than fighting them. That's when killing your opponents is the goal. In the first game you had a harpoon which facilitated drinking enemies outside of arm's length, but in the sequel it's used to throw enemies around instead. This physics-defying spike on a chain allows you to throw enemies at various environmental hazards, which occasionally leads to environmental puzzles. Puzzles which always have the same solution: throw a number of infinitely spawning enemies into an object. A fan, a wood chipper, helicopter blades, it doesn't matter what, just toss enemies at it until it breaks. This would be alright if it was 1 or 2, but often it's 5 or 6. Furthermore, it's not always clear if you're in one of these sections, or just stuck in an arena until you clear out an overabundance of enemies. The whole thing ends up feeling like an awkward cross between hack-and-slash games like God of War and character action games like Devil May Cry, but the game has neither the wide-reaching and impactful combat of the former, nor the precision of the latter. It never feels truly satisfying to engage with the combat in a way it seems you're meant to. Instead, you spend your time trying to work out which part of the combat system is most broken for a given encounter, and abusing it to victory. The environments you'll be fighting in are a mixed bag too. The pulp stylings of the earlier game have given way to a more comic book inspired tonality of the sequel, which is a disappointing if understandable switch. This sometimes leads environments in interesting creative directions, like the journey through the park after the cult has blocked out the sun with their blood-powered sky shield, but just as often leads to the environments feeling kind of stupid, like the giant unmissable tower that happens to be emitting said shield that both Rain and Brimstone apparently missed anyway. Most of the city has a run-down, grimy aesthetic that is pretty evocative of Gotham City and doesn't make for a particularly engaging exploration, though it's better than the lengthy sewer section. There are occasional glimpses of greatness, though, like the large Baroque manor the game starts in, or Kagan's tower block, the upper levels of which he's filled with portraits of himself and all his kids, which feels pretty out of character for him, but is a fun way to reuse early concept art. Unfortunately, even the good bits of the environmental work suffer from an inevitable comparison. Vampire the Masquerade isn't actually as influential as it first appears. The tabletop RPG is a wide collection of vampire mythology from across various tales and stories, combining basically every existing vampire trope into a single product, so any work that feels inspired by it is often more influenced by the works that were compiled into it in the first place. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, however, certainly casts a long shadow amongst games. Released just a month later, Bloodlines manages the same aesthetic of combining gothic feelings with modern environments, but it did so much more believably, while Bloodrayne 2 feels highly artificial. Both games also have a somewhat dated idea of what makes a game mature, but Bloodrayne 2 will suffer much worse from this. As part of the marketing for Bloodrayne 2, Rain receives the, let's be generous and say honour, dubious though it might be, of being the first video game character to appear topless in a Playboy magazine. Insert celebratory trumpets here. In an issue advertising college co-eds going wild and an interview with Donald Trump of all people, Rain appears with the ladies out in an article entitled Gaming Grows Up. It opens thusly, quote, "Sure, kids play video games, and they don't stop when they grow up. Anyone looking for proof is directed to Miss Bloodrayne left. Does she look like something a tween could handle? Today's average gamer is a ripe 29 years of age. And to keep their newest target demographic happy, the digital diversions of 2004 are packed with more hot women, fast cars, and big guns than ever before." End quote. Despite claiming to be an in-depth look at the future of games, the rest of the article is a series of brief previews of games that fit the Playboy attitude of maturity: guns, cars, and women. GTA San Andreas, Need for Speed Underground 2, Call of Duty United Offensive. There are some good games mentioned briefly, also a lot less well-renowned titles, such as Playboy's own knockoff Sims game that would release the next year, all adorned by a parade of other video game women in various states of undress. I can forgive the article getting her name wrong. To be fair, the original game's tutorial also misnamed her as Bloodrayne. I can even forgive that they started a sentence with the word "and", but this is possibly the single most immature take on gaming I think I've ever heard. 2004 would actually have been a good time to discuss the maturation of games as a medium. Silent Hill, Metal Gear Solid, Half-Life 2, all of these games and series were out or would soon come out and help push the medium forward in mature and thoughtful directions. Playboy has always had something of a twisted view of maturity and masculinity both, but just because something is inappropriate for children does not make it mature. The tits and violence that Playboy posits is representative of gaming growing up, and that takes centre stage in Bloodrayne 2's design, are certainly not appropriate for children, but that doesn't stop it from being incredibly juvenile. I said earlier I had no problem with the sexualization of Rain, but the way the sequel goes about it feels more problematic. Despite the blood-drinking audio being toned down, the sexualization of Rain is even more central to the game's identity, with far more attention to, and comments on, Rain's appearance throughout, which isn't a major issue, but the two other women who feature as major villains of the early game are equally sexualized, and also pushed out of the way to serve the real masterminds behind the plot, who are of course men. These minor narrative shifts push the game from something sexually objectifying in a way that feels mostly harmless, to being kind of sexist in a way that may not be. I don't think that's the game Terminal Reality wanted to make. I think that they were aiming for something similar to the first, but the subtle shift of pushing the women into more explicitly subservient roles within the plot, while taking more pains to emphasise and exhibit their appearances, makes the game feel far more uncomfortable in its treatment of women, which is made worse by the attempts to pass this off as maturity. I don't have any problems with sexualized content, and I don't think less of people who do enjoy it, but it baffles me when people try to pass these attitudes off as mature. It is certainly not mature to play such things, or to create such things. It is a teenager's attitude to adulthood, to believe that sexy ladies and violence is what makes something mature. Despite the adult content, Bloodrayne 2 is tonally very juvenile, in a way the original managed to broadly avoid. The original was certainly no high art either, but at least it avoided the pitfalls of feeling like it was exclusively targeting teenage boys trying to hide the game from their mothers. This comes through across many other aspects of the game, from the more colourful art style to the plot that manages to be simultaneously simple in its delivery and convoluted in its development. I mentioned that the game felt more like it took after comics than pulp magazines, and this is a lot of what I meant by that. When pulp magazines started to go out of fashion, various other mediums filled the gap in the market. The attitudes of the more action-focused pulp works would carry on into comics, albeit with a younger target demographic, and this is the feeling that Bloodrayne 2 conveys throughout. Like its target demographic has gotten younger than the previous games Terminal Reality has released. Could a tween handle Bloodrayne 2? Probably, though if they are, they should probably be better supervised, and I'd likely still advise that they play something better instead. It's disappointing, ultimately. Don't get me wrong, Bloodrayne certainly felt like a game pandering to a male demographic, but Bloodrayne 2 exaggerates the immature aspects of the design, and feels like it's pandering not to men, but to teenage boys instead, and I wish it had been aiming just a little higher by being a little more aware of the treatment of its characters as characters, not just as objects. After Bloodrayne 2, the series saw a rapid decrease in relevance. A third game would be released, a 2D action platformer, and there would be a run of comics that would eventually peter out. The franchise never saw the success that Terminal Reality was hoping they would. That said, I don't know if this is necessarily the last we've seen of Miss Bloodrayne. In 2020, publisher Ziggurat Interactive bought the rights to the franchise from Majesco and have since been working with Terminal Reality on updated releases of the earlier games, namely the terminal cuts for PC, the versions used in this video, followed by the revamped editions for the consoles, and they do appear to have plans to revitalise the series with a new game in future. I hope they do. Juvenile though it may be, murdering a bunch of dudes as a sexy vampire lady is certainly a good time, but it'd be nice if it tried to be appropriate for a mature audience instead of simply being inappropriate for a younger one. Thanks for watching.